Hello, I am continuing reading Many Lifetimes, a collaboration between Joan Marshall Grant and her then husband Dennis Kelsey. She passed away in 1989. She was a seer and a writer of her own far memories. She wrote 7 books about her far memories, and she wrote a beautiful novel as well, The Lad and the Lady. She is describing here her experiences when she could see people who were already dead to others. I continue chapter, I think it's chapter 10. Is it 10 or 9? No, chapter 9, An Assortment of Apparitions. And I finished that her dog could also see the invisible dog one of her visitors had. He was a ghost, and so was his dog, and her own dog could see him. The only people he alarms are occasional visitors who are scared when the children talk to him, and when they see our Labrador playing with an invisible dog. It is somewhat surprising to discover that one's own ghost can be seen as most convincingly solid even when one is wide awake. An example of this phenomenon, sometimes called astral projection, concerned Charles when he was on the French Riviera in 1958. He was sharing a villa near Menton with 6 other young people, and one day, having decided to go for a long walk while the others played golf, arranged to meet them at 8 o'clock in a cafe opposite the casino. They had been waiting for him for about 20 minutes when they saw him approaching across the square, looking very dishevelled and wearing only a pair of torn khaki shorts. This surprised them, for they were to dine at a restaurant which expected its clients to be formally dressed, and Charles had told the other 2 men to wear dinner jackets. As Charles was striding past, they stood up and waved to attract his attention. They shouted, but he took no notice, and they saw him walk briskly into the casino. Thinking he had mistaken the rendezvous and expected to find them in the casino bar, they followed him there, but although they searched the place thoroughly, they could not find him. By now annoyed, because they had thought he was deliberately avoiding them, they went off to dine and got back to the villa about midnight. They found Charles in bed, with a badly wrenched knee and multiple cuts and bruises. He had climbed a precipice during the morning, found he could not reach the top of it because of an overhang, and when trying to climb down again, had been stranded on a narrow ledge by a small landslide which had swept away the holds he had used on the way up. Below him was a 60-foot drop, and having discovered that the rock was friable, he was reluctant to thrust his weight on the only fingerhold within reach, so he decided to shout until someone heard him who could fetch a rope and haul him up. He stayed there for 7 hours, shouting, until he became too hoarse and too thirsty to do more than croak. He is exceedingly meticulous about keeping appointments to the minute, especially when he is to be the host, so he became increasingly anxious at the thought of his friends waiting for him. Eventually, his anxiety was stronger than his caution, which is always minimal, so he decided not to wait any longer for rescue. At the time he was seen in Menton, he was spread-eagled against the rock face. His foothold had given way, and he was clinging by his fingers to a narrow crack, with the added hazard of being blinded by the sweat pouring down his forehead. Eventually his hands became cramped, and he fell to land in a Brazilian thorn bush. But this failed to support him for more than a couple of seconds, and he rolled another 50 feet before he could start limping, and then crawling down to the track, where he got a lift home on an ox cart. I think many people may have seen someone who had no 3-dimensional reality without realizing that they have done so, as our doctor's wife, whom I will call Lydia. discovered when I was living at Trelleborg. I was driving home one evening when I suddenly remembered that she was in the cottage hospital because the following morning she was to have a caesarean for the birth of her second child. So I took her some flowers and gossiped for a few minutes, but only about trivialities, for at that time I had only met her briefly, and as I knew she had a rigid religious background, I had carefully avoided mentioning my somewhat unconventional ideas. I knew, because her husband had told me, that the birth of her first child had been hazardous. After 3 days in labor she had had an emergency caesarean, which was followed by a paralytic ileus, a dangerous complication from which she nearly died. Her husband's present anxiety was increased by the fact that she was terrified of being given an anesthetic, and always suffered from violent vomiting after ether. This was before pentothal was in general use. The following morning I was engaged in one of my periodic bouts of rearranging furniture. With the assistance of 3 gardeners I had taken a large bookcase to pieces, so that it could be moved into another room, when I suddenly noticed that it was 11 o'clock. Lydia's operation was scheduled for noon, so I thought of her intently for 2 or 3 minutes, visualizing her in her hospital room, which had a French window opening on the garden. Then I asked that someone should keep a friendly eye on her, especially before and during the anesthetic. I did not consciously think of her again that morning, and the only slightly unusual incident was that I was startled when the luncheon gong rang, for I thought it was only 11:30 instead of 1 o'clock. That evening the doctor called at the house to thank me for being of inestimable help to his wife. He told me that at 11 o'clock he had left her alone, as although she was very agitated, he felt that his presence was only making her worse. And when he came back to take her to the theatre, he found her perfectly tranquil, even drowsy, which amazed him, for she had had no premedication, as she reacted badly to morphia. She told him that after he had left the room, I walked into it through the French window and had sat by her bed, chatting so entertainingly that she had forgotten to be frightened. She seemed surprised that he had not seen me, as I had only just left. She said I had reassured her that she would feel so sleepy before she reached the theatre that she would need very little anesthetic, that the baby would be fine, that she would not feel even a twinge of nausea when she came round, and would have no more pain than could be fixed with a couple of aspirins. This is exactly what happened, a benign series of events which the doctor attributed to my powers of suggestion. He even thanked me for being tactful enough to visit Lydia by way of the garden entrance, so avoiding the dragon of a matron who would have opposed my seeing her. I had to produce several witnesses before he was convinced that my physical body had not been within 4 miles of the hospital. I saw Lydia several times before I told her what had actually occurred, having warned her husband not to do so prematurely. She exclaimed, "Thank goodness I didn't know you weren't solid. I should have been terrified if I'd known I was seeing a ghost." According to our terminology, Lydia's use of the word ghost was technically incorrect. She was seeing an aspect of my integrated self, which, acting independently of my physical body, had been able to condense sufficiently to appear substantial. A ghost is a dissociated fragment of a personality, which has become split off from the rest, and it remains self-imprisoned in a timeless present, while the integrated components continue the normal process of evolution. It has only a limited amount of energy, and this will eventually run down, so a modern building is far more likely to be haunted than a medieval dungeon. So long as a ghost remains extant, it can impinge upon a subsequent personality and may be responsible for irrational fears, compulsive behavior, or psychosomatic conditions. For instance, if the ghost had remained in the Brussels hotel, it might be causing some man or woman, who by now could be over 30, to have an exaggerated fear of heights. Such symptoms are, in effect, the ghost's appeal to be accepted once more into the family of the personality, and the release of the ghost can result in the instant disappearance of a previously intractable symptom. It seems that the essential factor in releasing a ghost is to identify with it sufficiently to understand its particular needs. This need can be extraordinarily specific, as I learned through old Morgan while I was still living at Trillioden in Cornwall. Old Morgan, so called to distinguish him from young Morgan, who was a mere stripling in his 70s, had a cottage near the top lodge. At the age of 93 he developed dropsy, and was so indignant at the prospect of being bedridden that the doctor threatened to send him to hospital unless he allowed himself to be nursed instead of crawling downstairs. His sisters could not keep him in order, so Charles and I took over the job of keeping him in bed and amused during his waking hours, which was a long day as he woke with the roosters. Although that July was exceptionally hot and his bedroom stifling, he refused to let us open the window, because, although he was accustomed to working outdoors in the hardest weather, he believed that fresh air when breathed between four walls was virtually lethal. We managed to keep him cheerful, and in fact he frequently remarked that his deathbed was proving the finest holiday he had ever enjoyed. When, on the 14th day, he asked for another noggin of the brandy, with which we kept him and ourselves copiously supplied, he raised his glass and gave us a most moving valedictory toast. Then he lay back on his pillow so serenely that it was several minutes before we realized he had died. As he had taken a most sportive view of the joys awaiting him in heaven, I was dismayed when I woke the following morning and knew I had been in the churchyard where old Morgan was lying placidly in his open grave. It was not a 6-foot trench, but a shallow depression lined with the finest bowling green turf, with the end curved to provide a comfortable headrest. I presumed that he was determined not to miss his funeral, but as it was not scheduled to take place until 3 days later, I told him to get up. To this he replied emphatically, "This is my grave, Mrs. Charles, and in it I shall lie until the last trump." This was a hazard which I had not envisaged, for although he went to church every Sunday, he had seemed free of the dogmatic beliefs which can land the newly dead in difficulties. So on the following night, when, in spite of my best persuasions, he remained obdurate, I left him while I achieved a convincing semblance of the conventional angel, complete with wings, white draperies, and a Madonna lily. This apparition caused him to peer over the side of his grassy trough, but seeing that none of the other graves showed any signs of disturbance, he declared, "I'm not going to cheat my friends by going to heaven before it is officially declared open." I cannot remember why I then found myself in the guise of a young woman, wearing an Edwardian dress and tightly corseted. Carrying a parasol in one hand and a basket of roses in the other, I heard myself saying in a kindly but peremptory voice, "Morgan, get out of that grave immediately. It is quite ridiculous to stay there another instant when I require you to help me with my gardens. With a smile of ineffable joy he exclaimed, "Very good, your Grace," and sprang lithely to his feet. I found myself still the Edwardian lady, standing with him on a rustic bridge, which spanned a stream alight with water-lilies. His delight at the height of the rhododendrons and azaleas, the profluence of primroses, the profusion of water-loving plants beside the lake, showed me that he had known them when they were planted, to translate a dream into reality. I remember seeing the great Jews clipped into a masterpiece of topiary, roses and yet more roses, swathed of lawn and leaping fountains. Suddenly he noticed that each flower, each leaf, even each blade of grass was in its perfection. It was then that he exclaimed, "I am in heaven." Through discreet questioning of Morgan's sister, Jemima, I learned that his ideal of womanhood had been the Duchess of N., for whom he had worked as a very junior member of a team of 30 gardeners during his early 20s. Jemima looked at me very straightly with her penetrating grey eyes and said, "Morgan made a vow, when he was only a boy, that he would not enter heaven, even if St. Peter himself opened the gates, until the Duchess told him to come in." And that was the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10 is Ray by Dennis Kelsey. Chapter 10. Have a wonderful Thursday.